The wind howled through the Colorado night, its icy fingers scraping across the barren landscape, rattling windows and bending trees. The storm was brutal, unleashing its fury on the rolling hills outside the small ranch house. Inside, the flicker of a single lamp cast long shadows, illuminating a young man sitting in the corner of the room, his gaze fixed on a monitor. The camera feed on the screen was grainy, showing nothing but darkness, save for the occasional flash of movement. Caleb Monroe, only 19, adjusted the lens focus, his knuckles white as they gripped the mouse. He had always been an observer, a quiet presence who kept to himself, hidden in the corners of life. He wasn't the type to attract attention, not from the town or from anyone else. But tonight, something had changed. The footage showed the black stallion pacing back and forth, his hooves echoing in the empty night, a silhouette against the dim light spilling from the barn. Caleb had found the horse just a few days ago, a dying animal, broken and alone. Now, he watched as the creature moved in nervous circles, his breath coming out in heavy, ragged bursts. They said it wasn't his horse, Caleb muttered to himself. His voice barely reached above a whisper, but the weight of the words felt like an avalanche. They sent threats, lawyers, even armed men. But none of that had moved Caleb, not one bit. The horse's presence was like a beacon in the dark. Thunder. That was what Caleb had named him. After the rumbling storm that had brought him to this ranch in the first place, he couldn't remember the last time he had seen a creature so desperate, so afraid. Thunder's dark coat was ragged and scarred, a testament to the abuse he had endured. Caleb had been there for a lot of things in his life. He had lost both of his parents when he was just a boy, the tragedy leaving him to fend for himself on this rundown ranch. His father had once dreamed of turning the place into something grand, but that dream had died with him. Now, the only thing that kept Caleb going was the quiet comfort of caring for animals. The ones that needed saving, the ones that couldn't speak for themselves. And Thunder needed him, just like he needed the land. The camera feed shifted as Thunder moved closer to the barn, his hooves softening, their rhythmic pounding. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't move from his spot. His gaze never wavered from the monitor. Thunder wasn't just any horse, he was a symbol. They said I couldn't keep him, that he didn't belong to me. Caleb's voice cracked as the words tumbled from his lips. But there was no fear in his heart, no hesitation. The storm outside intensified, lightning flashing across the sky. A single figure in the dark, silhouetted by the storm's fury. Oh, it walked into view of the camera. It was the man from town, the one who had shown up earlier, uninvited, with a warning. The man's voice had been cold, as if he was speaking from a place far removed from anything human. That horse wasn't yours to keep, kid. But Caleb didn't back down. Then, why was he dying in the woods? His voice was quiet, but strong, unwavering. He didn't need an answer. He didn't expect one. Thunder stood still, his head lifted, eyes wide, scanning the storm. It was as if the horse knew what was coming, and it was like he could sense that Caleb wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The man on the camera continued to advance toward the barn, his steps sure, confident. He hadn't expected Caleb to fight back. But Caleb was already done being afraid. The storm raged outside. The world felt on the brink of something immense, something inevitable. Caleb stared at the horse through the screen, watching as Thunder's ears flicked back, his body stiffening, sensing the intrusion, sensing the danger. In that moment, Caleb knew that no matter what happened, no matter what threats were made or what weapons were drawn, he wasn't going to back down. The boy wouldn't budge, and neither would the horse. Underscore, 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 underscore. I've set up the dramatic tension between Caleb, the horse, and the looming threat. Would you like to continue with part 2 based on this tone and pacing? Let me know if you want any adjustments to make the story even more vivid. Ben da Noe, Viet Fan, 2800 tu de Lin Theo, dan I toi gu bang, king an my chat GPT, do Noi. Part 2. Meet Caleb, the quiet rescuer. Caleb Monroe had always been a quiet soul. At just 19 years old, he had lived through more than most people could fathom. Born in a small town in Colorado, he had lost his parents before he even understood what it meant to be truly alone. His father had been a rancher, always dreaming of turning their small plot of land into a thriving operation, but the world had different plans. The day Caleb's father died in a tragic accident, the dream died with him. His mother followed soon after, succumbing to an illness that left Caleb to fend for himself on the old ranch. The house, weathered and cracked by time, was far from anything that could be called comfortable. Caleb didn't mind. He had always preferred the solitude. The ranch was a place of quiet, a place where his only company were the animals he cared for. Horses, dogs, even the occasional stray cat. They didn't demand anything more than a kind touch and a steady hand, and that was something Caleb could offer in abundance. But it wasn't just the animals that had drawn Caleb into this isolated life. There was a deep-seated need in him to nurture, to fix what had been broken. Animals, unlike people, didn't lie. They didn't pretend to be something they weren't. They were honest in their pain, in their fear, and in their loyalty. One of the things that Caleb had learned in his young life was that people could be cruel. The world, especially the one that existed outside the ranch's worn-out gates, could chew you up and spit you out without so much as a second glance. Caleb had witnessed the cruelty of a world that wasn't built for the weak, the gentle, or the quiet. But out here, in the isolation of the ranch, there was a small semblance of peace, even if it was fragile. On the night that thunder had appeared, the wind howled as it had on countless nights before, but this storm felt different. Caleb had been sitting in his modest living room, nursing a cup of coffee, when the first flashes of lightning cracked across the sky, followed by the deep growl of thunder. He had learned to appreciate the storms. They were a reminder of nature's power, of its ability to rebuild and renew. But that night, the storm wasn't the only thing that stirred. The sound of hooves crashing through the muddy earth broke through the storm's roar, the desperate sound reaching Caleb's ears as he sat by the window. He was used to hearing the animals around the ranch, the neighing of horses, the low growl of the dogs. But this sound was different. It was frantic, unsettling. Without thinking, Caleb grabbed his jacket and rushed outside. His boots splashed through the growing puddles, and the wind stung his face as he pushed forward, trying to find the source of the disturbance. It didn't take long before he saw him, a black stallion, covered in mud and blood, his body trembling with exhaustion. The horse's coat, once sleek and glossy, was now matted with dirt and cuts. He was limping badly, his hooves unsteady beneath him, as if he was trying to fight against a force greater than his own body could handle. Caleb felt a pang in his chest. He knew pain. He knew loss. And seeing this animal, clearly on the verge of collapse, mirrored a part of his own brokenness. There was something in the horse's eyes that spoke to him, a raw desperation that Caleb couldn't ignore. The storm seemed to fade away as he knelt beside the animal, his hand reaching out, his fingers trembling as he touched the horse's damp fur. For a moment, everything else fell away. There was no ranch, no isolation, no past pain. Just Caleb and this horse, two lost souls in the midst of a storm. He didn't know where the horse had come from or why he had been left to suffer on the side of the river. There was no brand, no tag, no indication of ownership. But Caleb knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave him out there. Not like this. With great effort, Caleb helped the stallion to his feet. It wasn't easy, the animal's weight a burden that Caleb barely managed to bear, but somehow he got him into the barn. He set to work immediately, cleaning the cuts, soothing the horse with soft words as he worked to make him comfortable. He named him Thunder. In the days that followed, Caleb worked tirelessly to nurse the horse back to health. He'd spent hours in the barn, cleaning wounds, feeding him, and offering the kind of care that the horse had clearly never received before. Thunder's recovery was slow, but Caleb could see the horse begin to regain strength. Each day, he stood a little taller, walked a little farther, and trusted Caleb just a little more. And as Thunder began to heal physically, something else started to change. The horse's presence seemed to soothe Caleb, to fill a hole he didn't realize was there. For the first time in a long time, he felt needed. The connection between the two of them was undeniable. It was a bond that only grew stronger with each passing day. The storm had brought Thunder to Caleb's doorstep, but it was the quiet resilience of Caleb himself that had saved the horse. Caleb's life, once solitary and filled with the silence of a lonely ranch, was beginning to change. The bond between him and Thunder was more than just a rescue story. It was the start of something much deeper, something that Caleb hadn't expected. He had always kept to himself, avoiding the world outside his ranch, but now the world seemed to be creeping closer. There was a sense of unrest in the air, something Caleb couldn't quite place. But the growing sense of unease gnawed at him. He had no idea just how soon his peaceful life would be turned upside down, or how much the horse, Thunder, would become not only his savior, but the key to a battle he hadn't yet prepared to fight. But for now, Caleb focused on the healing. He focused on Thunder. There was peace in the barn, and for the first time in a long time, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was finally home. It had been a week since Caleb had first found Thunder, and though the storm had passed, it seemed like the dark clouds refused to leave Caleb's life. Each day brought its own challenges, but none had been as alarming as the sudden drop in temperature the night before. Caleb had gotten used to the harsh weather, but this cold was something different, an unyielding chill that sank deep into his bones. It had been well past midnight when the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows of the old ranch house. Caleb had heard the soft scraping of branches against the walls, the wind whistling through the cracks in the doorframe. But it was the sound of hooves that woke him, faint at first, but growing louder. The sound echoed through the empty hallways, and it was enough to make his heart race. He grabbed his jacket, not even bothering to lace his boots, as he sprinted toward the barn, the world outside swallowed by the blackness of the night. As he pushed open the barn doors, the barn's dim lighting revealed the scene that left him breathless. Thunder was lying on the ground, his body trembling violently, his breathing shallow. His once sleek coat was now streaked with mud and dirt, and his legs were splayed awkwardly beneath him. The horse was in pain, that much was clear. Caleb's breath hitched in his throat as he knelt beside the animal, the cold barn floor biting into his knees. "Thunder," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. He placed a trembling hand on the horse's flank, trying to reassure him, but the animal's body was unresponsive. Thunder's eyes were wide with fear, his legs unsteady, and his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, Caleb felt the weight of helplessness settle over him. He had spent days caring for the horse, feeding him, offering comfort, but this was different. This wasn't just a scrape or a limp. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Thunder managed to lift his head, his eyes searching Caleb's face as if pleading for help. Caleb swallowed hard, feeling the rising panic claw at his chest. There was no time to waste. Without thinking, he scooped the horse's head into his arms, holding it gently as he whispered reassurances into the horse's ear. He knew he had to act fast, but his mind raced for a solution. Caleb worked quickly, trying to lift Thunder's heavy body, but the horse was too weak. He glanced around the barn, his eyes darting from one corner to the next, searching for something that could help. His gaze landed on the nearby rope and pulleys that hung from the rafters, tools he had used many times before to fix fences and mend broken equipment. But this wasn't a fence. This was a life. The panic that had begun to creep in threatened to overwhelm him, but Caleb shoved it down. He couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. He grabbed the rope, tying it securely to the beam overhead. With careful movements, Caleb worked to hoist Thunder's body upright, keeping his movements slow and steady, trying not to stress the horse more than he already had. The horse shuddered under Caleb's touch, but Thunder remained still, trusting him. The horse was broken, but he wasn't beyond saving. It took all of Caleb's strength, but he finally managed to get Thunder standing, his legs shaky but firm. The animal was still panting, his sides heaving, but at least he was on his feet. Caleb stroked the horse's damp mane, trying to calm him as he noticed the heavy marks of injury along Thunder's side. Deep gashes, raw and swollen, that hadn't been visible before. The injuries were severe, and Caleb knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. Desperation crept into his voice as he whispered to the horse, "I'll fix this. I'll make sure you're all right." But deep down, Caleb knew this wasn't just about fixing the horse's body. There was something much deeper going on, something Caleb couldn't explain. He felt a connection with Thunder that went beyond simply caring for an injured animal. The horse wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He had been broken in ways Caleb couldn't comprehend, and yet he had survived. "Hold on, Thunder," Caleb muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll get you to a vet. I'll make sure you don't have to suffer anymore." With every step, Caleb's heart pounded harder in his chest. He felt the weight of the world pressing on him, but the sound of Thunder's soft whinnies gave him strength. The horse had survived the storm, had endured the darkness, and was still fighting. Caleb wasn't about to let him down now. As he led Thunder out of the barn, Caleb's thoughts raced. He could feel the tension building, but he wasn't sure if it was just from the cold, the horse's injuries, or something else, something lurking just beyond his reach. For the first time, he wondered if Thunder had been sent to him for a reason, if this connection was something more than coincidence. But Caleb didn't have time for questions now. He needed to get Thunder to safety. He needed to get him help. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but Caleb was no stranger to uncertainty. He had learned to live with it, to survive it. And right now, Thunder was the one thing that mattered. As the cold night stretched on, Caleb helped Thunder along the dirt road, each step taken in unspoken silence. He would protect the horse, no matter what it took. And somehow, he knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, a journey that neither of them had expected, but one that would change everything. The sun had barely risen when Caleb finally returned to the ranch, exhausted and drained. The road had been long, and though the vet's clinic was only a few miles away, it felt like a lifetime. Thunder was still weak, but hanging on, his breath shallow but steady. Caleb had done what he could on his own, but there were limits to what even he could handle. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Emily, had been shocked by the condition of the horse. Thunder's wounds were deep, and the signs of malnutrition were evident. The horse had clearly been neglected, or worse, abused. But Caleb couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Thunder was alive, and that meant he had a chance. By the time Caleb had returned, it was late afternoon, and the ranch was eerily quiet. The wind had died down, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air, as though the world was holding its breath. Caleb led Thunder back into the barn and closed the doors softly behind him. He didn't know how much time they had, but he had every intention of making sure Thunder was safe. That's when the knock came. It was sharp, demanding, and it echoed through the silence of the ranch. Caleb froze, his heart beating faster as he turned toward the door. He hadn't been expecting anyone, but the suddenness of the sound set his nerves on edge. He glanced at Thunder, still lying down in the barn, his sides heaving with each shallow breath. Caleb couldn't leave him alone. Not now. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a voice that Caleb didn't recognize. "Caleb Monroe?" The voice was smooth, cold, and authoritative. "We need to talk." Caleb stood still, his mind racing. He had no idea who this man was, but something in the tone of his voice made his gut twist with unease. Slowly, he walked toward the door. each step feeling like it was echoing in the vast emptiness of the barn. When he opened the door, he was met with a man in a dark suit, his hands tucked neatly behind his back. The man was tall, with sharp features and a hard, calculating gaze. Caleb didn't recognize him, but the sense of power in the man's presence was undeniable. "Who are you?" Caleb asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising anxiety in his chest. "My name is Briggs," the man said smoothly, giving Caleb a quick once-over. "I'm here on behalf of Richard Vale." The name hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. Richard Vale, the wealthy businessman who owned half the land around them. The man who had the resources to buy anything and anyone. Caleb had heard the name before, in hushed whispers, in the context of the kind of people who use their money and influence to get what they wanted. "Vale doesn't own me," Caleb said, his voice colder than he intended. "And he doesn't own that horse either." Briggs raised an eyebrow, as though Caleb had just spoken nonsense. "That horse belongs to Mr. Vale, and I'm here to make sure it's returned to its rightful owner?" Caleb's jaw clenched. He wasn't in any condition to be anyone's horse when I found him. He was dying in the woods, and no one cared enough to help. The man, Briggs, didn't seem moved by Caleb's words. In fact, his expression hardened. "That may be, but the law says otherwise. And I'm here to make sure the law's followed." Caleb stood his ground, though his hands trembled with the effort. He wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when Thunder needed him. "Then you're going to have to prove it," Caleb shot back, his voice unwavering. Briggs's gaze sharpened, and Caleb could see the calculation behind his eyes. This wasn't a man who would let anything slip through his fingers. Caleb didn't need to be told that this was just the beginning of something far worse than he could have ever imagined. "I've already contacted the authorities," Briggs said, his voice cold and final. "And I'm afraid you won't be able to keep the horse for long. Mr. Vale has a lot of power in this town, and you're just one boy on a rundown ranch." Caleb felt his fists tighten at his sides. The fear that had been gnawing at him suddenly flared to life, but he refused to let it show. He had lived too long in the shadows to be intimidated now. If he's so powerful," Caleb said, his voice thick with defiance, "then why did he let his horse end up in the woods, barely hanging on?" Briggs faltered for just a second, and in that moment Caleb knew he'd struck a nerve. The man recovered quickly, though, his expression hardening again. "That's none of your business, boy. I'm here to take Thunder back, and if you know what's good for you, you'll let him go peacefully." Caleb didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stood tall, his eyes locked on Briggs with a quiet intensity. He wasn't sure what had come over him, but in that moment, something shifted. The ranch, the animals, the land, it was all a part of him. And he wasn't about to let anyone take it away, not without a fight. "I'm not giving him up," Caleb said firmly, his voice unwavering. Briggs stepped back, his eyes narrowing as he sized Caleb up. "We'll see about that. Mr. Vale doesn't like to be defied. And when he finds out what you've done, you'll regret it." And without another word, Briggs turned and walked away, disappearing into the distance. Caleb stood at the door for a moment longer, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The threat wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. Thunder had become more than just a horse. He was a symbol of something Caleb hadn't realized he was fighting for. Until now. The ranch, the animals, the quiet life Caleb had carved out for himself. All of it was at risk, and Caleb wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The following days on the ranch were filled with an unsettling silence, broken only by the relentless sound of the wind whipping through the barn and the occasional rustling of the animals. Caleb couldn't shake the sense that the quiet before the storm was not just figurative, but very much real. He had seen the warning in Briggs's eyes, the threat buried beneath his polished words. It was clear they weren't going to leave him alone, and they weren't going to stop until Thunder was gone. Despite everything, Caleb kept his promise to the horse. He continued to care for Thunder as best as he could, taking extra precautions to ensure that no one could sneak onto the property again. But as each day passed, it became harder to ignore the creeping anxiety in the pit of his stomach. Caleb could feel the pressure building, not just from the threat of Vale's men, but from a deeper, more dangerous force: fear. The first incident happened late one night, after Caleb had spent hours fixing the barn door that had been cracked during the storm. He had just finished locking up for the night when the sound of distant voices reached his ears. At first, it was barely audible, just a whisper carried on the wind. But as Caleb stepped outside, it grew louder, and it was coming from the road that ran alongside the ranch. He crept forward, careful not to make a sound. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the still night. When he reached the edge of the property, he could see shadows moving in the distance, cloaked figures moving like specters in the dark. Caleb's blood ran cold as he realized they were heading toward the barn. Before he could react, a shout rang out from the darkness, and Caleb ducked instinctively behind the large oak tree near the edge of the property. The figures stopped, their voices growing louder. One of them was laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. "That damn horse needs to go back to where it belongs," one voice muttered. "If Vale's paying, we'll make sure the kid doesn't get in the way." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, calculating the best way to confront them, but his body was frozen in place. He knew that the next few moments would decide everything. They were getting closer. It felt like hours before the figures finally turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. Caleb didn't move until the sounds of their conversation had completely vanished. Slowly, he stepped out from his hiding place and made his way back to the barn, his pulse still racing. But the sense of unease never left him. It was only a matter of time before they would come back. This time, though, Caleb was ready. He was done cowering in the dark. He had to protect Thunder. The second incident came just a few nights later. Caleb had just finished his evening chores when he noticed something strange. The fence that bordered the property, a large section near the back of the barn, had been slashed. The wire had been cut, and the posts were bent out of shape, like someone had tried to force their way through. Caleb's first instinct was to check on Thunder. He rushed into the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel. But when he opened the door, the horse was nowhere to be found. Panic flooded Caleb's chest. His heart raced as he ran out into the pasture, calling for Thunder. His voice was hoarse from shouting, but the only response he got was the wind, the cold air biting into his skin as he searched. Then he heard it. The sound of Thunder's hooves pounding against the earth. Caleb followed the sound, praying that the horse hadn't gone too far. He found him near the edge of the property, just beyond the broken fence. Thunder stood there, his head lowered, staring into the distance. It was in that moment that Caleb realized how much the horse had grown attached to him. Thunder had always been a quiet creature, but now it was as though the horse could sense the danger too. Thunder wasn't just protecting himself anymore, he was protecting Caleb. The next morning, Caleb didn't waste any time. He installed security cameras around the property, pointing them toward the fence line and the barn. He needed proof. If Vale's men were going to keep coming, Caleb would make sure there was evidence to show just how far they were willing to go. He posted the footage online, documenting the slashed fence, the late-night trespassing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Caleb wasn't the type to rely on others. But at this point, he had no choice. The town needed to know what was happening. It wasn't long before his actions sparked a response. Maya, a neighbor who had watched Caleb from a distance, showed up on his doorstep the following afternoon. She was a woman in her early 30s, with a strong jawline and a no-nonsense attitude. She had always been kind to Caleb, even when others avoided him, and she had seen the changes in the town over the years, the encroachment of Vale's influence, the way people had begun to fear the powerful businessman. Maya didn't waste any time. "I saw the footage you posted," she said, her eyes sharp and determined. "I'm calling a town meeting. We need to talk about what's going on here. Caleb hesitated, unsure of what Maya was proposing. What good is a meeting going to do? Vale has enough power to crush us. Maya crossed her arms, looking him square in the eye. We can't just stand by and let him take everything. If we don't start standing together, we're all going to lose something. She was right. Caleb knew that. He could see the signs now. The growing tension in the air. The whispers that were starting to take root. The town was afraid, but maybe they could be united by something stronger than fear. Fine, Caleb said quietly. Let's do it. That night, the town hall was filled with people Caleb barely knew. People who had lived in the area for years, but who hadn't said a word to him until now. There were murmurs of agreement, some hesitant, others more vocal in their support. As Caleb spoke about what had been happening, the room grew quiet. Some were afraid of the repercussions. Others, like Maya, saw this as more than just about one horse. It was about standing up for their land, their rights, and their future. They understood that if Vale could take Thunder, there was no telling what would come next. And as Caleb stood before the crowd, he realized something. It wasn't just about Thunder anymore. This was about fighting back. This was about making sure no one had to live in fear of someone like Vale. The pressure was mounting, but Caleb knew now that he wasn't alone. The townspeople were beginning to take sides, and the battle was just beginning. The town meeting had been an eye-opener for Caleb. In the beginning, it had felt like a desperate attempt to rally support. But as the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. The town, which had always seemed like a patchwork of individuals more concerned with their own survival than the collective good, began to shift. It wasn't just about Thunder anymore. It wasn't just about one boy standing up for a horse. It was about the larger struggle that had been simmering under the surface for years, a fight for control, for land, and for the right to choose one's own fate. By the time the meeting ended, Caleb felt both exhausted and energized. Maya had spoken passionately about the town's history, about how it had once been a place where people took care of each other, where they fought to protect what was theirs. The town hadn't lost its heart, but it had grown complacent. Fear, more than anything, had kept everyone silent. But now, that fear was being confronted head-on. The next day, the ripple effect of the meeting became apparent. Neighbors, some of whom Caleb had never spoken to, began showing up at the ranch with supplies, extra fencing, tools, even food. They didn't ask questions. They just came, one by one, to show their support for Caleb and Thunder. Word had spread, and people were beginning to talk. Maya had organized a plan to make the town's position clear, and it was something that Caleb hadn't expected. The plan was simple, yet powerful. A town-wide demonstration of solidarity. It wasn't going to be an angry protest or a fight. That wouldn't do any good. No, this was something more subtle, more effective. They would show Vale and anyone else who might be watching that the town was united. It was a quiet stand, but one that spoke volumes. We'll hold a meeting in the town square, Maya had explained. We'll keep it peaceful, but we'll make sure everyone knows where we stand. Caleb didn't fully understand what she meant at first, but as the day of the meeting approached, it became clearer. The demonstration wasn't just about protecting Thunder. It was about sending a message that the town would not back down, a message that they were not just going to let Vale push them around anymore. The town, once fragmented and hesitant, was coming together to show that their land, their livelihoods, and their dignity were not up for sale. The morning of the meeting, Caleb stood in his front yard, watching as people from every corner of the town began to gather. It was a striking sight. Farmers, ranchers, shop owners, and workers from the small town all walking toward the square, united by something stronger than fear. There was an energy in the air, a quiet determination that made Caleb stand taller than he had in a long time. Maya had been right. People were ready to fight, not with violence or threats, but with unity. By the time the crowd had gathered in the square, Caleb found himself standing at the front of the group, flanked by Maya and a few other prominent members of the town. They had set up a small stage for Caleb to speak, though he hadn't planned on saying much. He wasn't a speaker, never had been. He was the quiet type, the one who worked behind the scenes. But this wasn't about him. This was about the town, about showing that they wouldn't be cowed by fear any longer. As the crowd settled into place, Caleb took a deep breath and stepped onto the platform. The town square was packed, more people than he had ever seen in one place, their eyes on him. The air was thick with expectation, and for the first time in his life, Caleb felt the weight of something much larger than himself. I never thought I'd be standing up here, Caleb began, his voice steady but quiet. I've always kept to myself. My life was always about surviving, just getting by. I didn't want to get involved in anything bigger than that. But when I found Thunder, I knew I couldn't just walk away. That horse wasn't just an animal to me. He's a symbol of everything that's been broken and neglected in this town. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Caleb could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, but for once it didn't make him shrink. It gave him strength. We've all been living in fear, Caleb continued. Fear of losing our homes, our land, our way of life. But it's not just about that anymore. It's about standing up for what's right. It's about not letting someone like Vale come in here and take everything we've worked for. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, a low ripple that spread through the square. Caleb felt a surge of hope. They were with him. They were standing together. I can't do this alone, Caleb said, his voice growing stronger. But together, we can make a difference. Together, we can show Vale that we're not afraid to stand up for what's ours. We won't let him take Thunder, and we won't let him take our town. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in unison. Caleb wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way he had gone from the quiet boy on the rundown ranch to the voice of a movement. And he realized in that moment that this wasn't just about Thunder anymore. This was about something much bigger, the heart of the town, the spirit of the people who had been living in fear for far too long. The town had taken sides, and Caleb's side was stronger than ever. As the meeting wound down, the energy in the air didn't dissipate. It hung there, palpable, like a spark waiting to catch fire. Caleb knew that this was only the beginning. Vale hadn't seen the full force of what he had just stirred up, and neither had Caleb. The fight for Thunder was just the beginning of something much larger, something that would change this town forever. The days leading up to the showdown felt like a powder keg, each moment thick with tension. Caleb could sense the storm on the horizon, not one of nature, but of power and fear closing in on his ranch. Despite the unity the town had shown, Caleb knew that the real test was just beginning. Maya had kept the pressure on, gathering support, encouraging the people of the town to stand firm, but the truth was, Caleb was on his own in many ways. The town's support was valuable, yes, but there was a looming threat far more powerful than anything they had experienced before. Richard Vale was not a man who liked to lose. And when it came to his prized stallion, Thunder, Caleb had no illusions about what he would do to reclaim him. It was the morning of the showdown when Caleb first saw them. He had been up early, as usual, feeding the animals and checking the barn. Thunder was recovering, but Caleb could see that the horse still wasn't entirely strong, and the fear that had been instilled in him seemed to linger, a shadow, over his eyes. Caleb's heart clenched every time he saw it. He wished he could take that fear away, but he couldn't. He could only promise to protect him. Caleb was standing at the barn's entrance when the unmistakable sound of engines roared down the dirt road. His stomach dropped, and instinctively he moved toward the barn doors, blocking the entrance. He knew what was coming. A black SUV, its windows tinted and sleek, rolled up to the ranch gate. Two other vehicles followed closely behind. A large truck and another SUV, both armed with security personnel. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. There were no words exchanged at first, just the sound of doors slamming shut and the cold, silent menace of men who were there for one reason: to take Thunder. Richard Vale emerged first, his tall frame stepping out of the black SUV with the calm confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Behind him, two armed guards, their faces hard and expressionless, flanked him, creating a wall of intimidation. Caleb didn't move. His feet were rooted to the spot, even though his mind screamed at him to flee, to run, to escape. But there was no running. Not now. Vale looked Caleb up and down, his gaze dismissive. His suit was perfectly pressed, his demeanor cold and controlled, and Caleb knew that this wasn't just a negotiation. This was a man who expected obedience, who believed that money and power could bend the world to his will. "Where is it?" Vale's voice was smooth, devoid of emotion. "I'm not giving him back," Caleb replied, his voice steady, though every nerve in his body screamed at him to prepare for what was about to happen. Vale didn't flinch. He simply nodded to his guards, who stepped forward, their eyes scanning the area. Caleb's grip tightened on the worn fence post in front of him. He wasn't backing down. "Let me make this simple for you, Monroe," Vale said, his voice cold as ice. "You have one chance to do the right thing. Return the horse, and we'll forget this ever happened. Refuse, and I will make sure you regret it." Caleb's heart skipped, but he stood firm. "Thunder isn't just a horse to me. He's part of this ranch, part of this land, and I'm not going to let you take him from me." Vale's eyes narrowed, and for the first time there was a flicker of anger in them. "You don't understand. You never did. This is my property. And when you took what was mine, you crossed a line?" Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He had heard rumors, whispers about Vale's ruthless nature, but hearing it from the man himself made it all the more real. He wasn't dealing with a businessman. He was dealing with a bully, a man who crushed anything that dared to stand in his way. The guards stepped closer, their hands hovering near their holsters. Caleb instinctively took a step back, but quickly regained his composure. He couldn't let them intimidate him. Not now. Yeah, but then something unexpected happened. From behind Caleb, a voice called out, "You'll have to go through all of us." Caleb turned in surprise. Maya, along with several other townspeople, had emerged from the shadows, standing together at the far end of the property. They weren't armed, they weren't violent, but they were there. Their faces were set in determination, and there was no hesitation in their stance. "You can't just take his horse," Maya continued, her voice clear and resolute. "This isn't just about one ranch, one horse. It's about the town, it's about us, and we won't let you walk all over us anymore." One by one, other townspeople emerged, stepping forward to join the growing group. Some were old, others young, some farmers, others workers from the small shops. They had come in quiet solidarity, refusing to let Caleb stand alone. Vale's face hardened, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You're all just a bunch of cattle. You think you can stop me?" The guards took a step forward, but Caleb raised his hand, his voice rising above the tension. "No, Vale, it's you who's outnumbered now." The crowd shifted, a collective murmur rippling through them, growing louder, stronger. "We're not afraid of you anymore," a voice from the crowd called out. "You can't just take everything, not without a fight." The armed guards exchanged uncertain glances, and for the first time, Caleb saw a flicker of doubt in Vale's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was there. The town wasn't backing down. Caleb wasn't alone. "I'm not leaving here without that horse," Vale snarled, but his voice was tinged with frustration. "You'll have to go through all of us first," Maya repeated, her words clear, unwavering. The standoff stretched on, the tension thick in the air, but the town stood its ground. Caleb felt something shift within him, something he had never experienced before, not just fear, but the strength of unity. Vale might have had power, he might have had money, but the town had something that was worth more than both combined. They had each other. The standoff between Caleb and Richard Vale had reached a breaking point. The air was thick with anticipation. the tension palpable in every breath the townspeople took. Vale, his face twisted with frustration, stood motionless as his guards flanked him, still unsure whether to advance or retreat. The force of the town's unity had rattled him, but it hadn't broken him. Not yet. Caleb could feel his pulse racing. Every muscle in his body was taut with the pressure of the moment. He had never imagined that his quiet life on the ranch would lead to this. Standing toe-to-toe with a man who controlled so much of the land, a man who was used to taking what he wanted without question. But here, in this small corner of the world, Caleb had found something more powerful than Vale's wealth and influence. He had found the people who stood with him, the town that refused to let fear dictate their future. But just as it seemed like the conflict would spiral into something worse, something unexpected happened. A figure stepped out from the crowd. It was a man Caleb had never met before, someone who hadn't been at the town meeting. His face was weathered, his hands rough from years of hard work. His clothes were simple, but there was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. His name was Darrell, and Caleb's eyes narrowed as the man made his way to the front of the group, the crowd parting to let him through. Darrell had worked for Richard Vale years ago, long before Caleb had ever heard of the man. In fact, Darrell had been one of the ranch hands on Vale's sprawling estate, the very place where Thunder had been kept before Caleb found him. Caleb had heard whispers about Vale's cruelty, about the way he treated the animals on his property, but he had never heard the full story. Until now, Darrell stopped a few feet from Caleb, standing tall and steady. Vale turned his gaze to him, his lips curling into a tight smile. "What's this? Another one of your little farmers coming to lecture me?" But Darrell wasn't interested in Vale's taunts. He didn't even acknowledge the man's presence as he turned to face the crowd. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of years of hidden truths. "I worked for Richard Vale," Darrell began, his voice steady and calm. "I was there when Thunder was brought to the ranch. I was there when he was first brought in, all skinny and scared. Vale didn't care about that horse. He never cared about any of the animals on that land. He used them, abused them." The crowd was silent, listening intently as Darrell continued, his words like a spark to dry tinder. "They starved him, left him in a pen with no food, no water for days at a time. I saw it with my own eyes. Vale wanted Thunder for breeding, to make more horses he could sell, but he didn't care about the creature. Thunder was just another asset to him, something to be exploited. And when Thunder got sick, when he got injured, Vale didn't even care enough to get him proper care. He left him to die." Caleb's breath hitched as he listened. He had always known something was wrong, but hearing the truth from someone who had been there, who had witnessed the abuse firsthand, hit him harder than he expected. "Vale didn't care about Thunder," Darrell went on, his voice growing stronger. "He didn't care about any of the animals on his land. But I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't watch him torture them, and when I tried to speak up, Vale made sure I was out of the picture. He fired me, got rid of me. But I know the truth, and I'm not going to stand by and let him take that horse." The crowd gasped in shock. Darrell's words were like a bombshell, revealing the heart of the abuse that had been hidden behind Vale's wealth and power. Caleb felt his anger boil beneath the surface. But there was something more in his chest now, something far stronger than resentment. It was the feeling of justice, of knowing that the truth was finally coming to light. Vale's face reddened with rage as he stepped forward. "You're lying, Darrell. You've always been nothing but a disgruntled worker who couldn't do his job. No one will believe you." But Darrell didn't flinch. He stood tall, unwavering. "I don't care if you believe me, Vale. The truth is out there now, and people know who you really are." Caleb felt a weight lift off his shoulders as the truth settled in. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It wasn't just about protecting Thunder. It was about exposing the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long. Darrell had given them the ammunition they needed, and now the town had the truth on their side. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady and commanding. "We've all heard the stories, Vale. We've seen the damage you've done, and we won't let you destroy this town, this land, or this horse. Not anymore." The crowd rallied behind her, their voices growing louder, their unity undeniable. It was clear that Vale's power no longer held the same sway. The truth had shattered his grip on the town, and Caleb could see the fear in Vale's eyes as he looked at the townspeople who were no longer backing down. Vale's expression twisted, his anger boiling over. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Monroe. This isn't over by a long shot." But Caleb, fueled by the strength of the town's support and the undeniable truth that had just been exposed, stood firm. He wasn't going anywhere. He had fought for this land, for this horse, and now the town had joined him. They had taken their stand, and they weren't going to let anyone, not even Vale, tear it away from them. "We've won," Caleb said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You've lost." Vale glared at him one last time, then turned on his heel, signaling his men to follow him. The showdown was over, but the battle for Thunder, for the ranch, and for the future of the town had only just begun. The dust hadn't even settled from the confrontation when Caleb stood at the edge of the ranch, watching as Vale's men retreated in their vehicles, their engines roaring into the distance. The scene had played out like something from a dream. The overwhelming pressure, the fear, and the anger. All of it had been there, building toward that one final moment. And now it was over. But in that silence, something deeper took root. Caleb hadn't realized it at the time, but standing there, staring at the taillights of Vale's vehicles disappearing into the distance, a quiet victory had washed over him. The truth had been spoken. The town had stood together. And for the first time, Caleb truly believed that the fight for Thunder was something he could win. Maya stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The townspeople were still gathered in the square, murmuring among themselves, processing what had just happened. Caleb could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the same uncertainty that had been there when they'd first come together. But it was different now. The fear was gone. They had taken the first step toward reclaiming what had been theirs for so long. "You did it," Maya said softly, her eyes lingering on the retreating vehicles. "You didn't back down. You gave them something they can't ignore." Caleb nodded, his heart still racing, but with a sense of relief that he hadn't expected. "We did it," he corrected, his voice quiet. "This wasn't just me. It was the whole town, everyone standing together. That's what made the difference." Maya smiled, a faint trace of pride in her eyes. "That's right. You weren't alone in this." But despite the fleeting sense of triumph, Caleb knew that this wasn't over. Vale may have backed off for now, but Caleb could feel that this was only the beginning. This was just the first battle in a much larger war. The town had proven they wouldn't be silenced, but there were still other battles to fight. The truth about Vale's cruelty had come to light, but there were still people in town who feared his retribution. Caleb knew that it would take time to heal the scars, to rebuild trust, and to ensure that no one would ever feel powerless again. Later that evening, as Caleb sat on the porch of his ranch house, staring at the horizon, the weight of the past few days finally settled in. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but there was something else, too. Something he couldn't quite name. It was the realization that his life had changed forever. He had started out as a quiet, solitary rancher, living on the fringes of the world, and now, here he was, the heart of a movement that had brought an entire town together. As he leaned back in his chair, the sound of Thunder's hooves clopped softly against the ground. Caleb's gaze shifted to the barn, where the black stallion stood in the open doorway, his eyes bright and calm. Thunder was stronger now. No longer the scared, limping animal Caleb had found in the woods. He was standing tall, proud, and free. Caleb smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet joy. This wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was about something far greater. It was about the strength that comes from standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. It was about fighting for justice, for animals, for the land, for the people who had no voice, no power, It was about the realization that even in a world that seemed determined to break you, there was always a way to fight back. The next morning, Caleb woke early, as he always did, but today felt different. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a renewed energy that Caleb couldn't ignore. As he walked through the barn, checking on the animals, he noticed that something had shifted. The ranch no longer felt like a place of solitude, a place of just survival. It felt like a home that he had fought for and earned. As he moved toward the back of the barn, Caleb spotted something that hadn't been there the day before. A sign. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. Safe Hooves Ranch. The words stopped Caleb in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat. The sign had been placed at the entrance of the barn, its letters simple but clear. It was a symbol of something new, something born from the ashes of everything he had fought for. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing for animals like Thunder, for those who needed a second chance. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat as he reached out and touched the sign. Safe Hooves Ranch. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. The idea had been brewing in his mind for days now, ever since Thunder had come into his life. But now, it was real. He could see it now. Not just the barn, but a whole new future for the ranch, for the animals, and for the people who needed a place of refuge. The town had supported him in ways he never expected, and now it was time for him to give back. The barn doors creaked open as Caleb stepped inside, and Thunder, as if sensing the change in the air, trotted over to him, nuzzling his shoulder. Caleb chuckled, his hand running through the horse's mane. "You're going to be the first one, aren't you?" Caleb said softly, his voice filled with affection. Thunder nickered as though in agreement. The thought of what could be, of what he could build, filled Caleb with hope. There were still challenges ahead. There were still forces that sought to take control, that sought to break him in the town. But now, Caleb knew one thing for sure. He was not alone, and neither was Thunder. They had each other, and together they would face whatever came next. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and Caleb looked up to see Maya walking toward the barn, a hopeful smile on her face. "It's time to build something new, isn't it?" she asked, her voice filled with optimism. Caleb nodded, his heart swelling with a quiet determination. "Yeah, it is. And we're going to make sure that this time we do it right." And so, with Thunder by his side and the town behind him, Caleb began to build something greater than just a sanctuary for animals. He was building a place of hope, a place of refuge, a place where justice could take root, and where the heart of the town would finally be safe. The days following the showdown with Richard Vale were filled with a quiet kind of victory. Caleb had expected relief, but what he didn't anticipate was how deeply the events had affected him. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and the power of standing together. Now, with Safe Hooves Ranch officially opened, the work had just begun. Caleb had always known that healing wasn't a quick process, not for animals, not for people, and certainly not for a community scarred by years of fear and manipulation. But as he watched the townspeople return, as they helped him rebuild and redefine the ranch, Caleb knew that this was only the start. It was early in the morning when Caleb stood outside the barn, watching the sun rise over the mountains, its golden rays touching the earth with a soft warmth. The world felt different now. Quieter, more at peace. He took a deep breath, savoring the air, and felt Thunder's presence beside him. The black stallion stood by his side, his coat shining in the morning light. Thunder had come a long way since that first night Caleb had found him on the edge of the woods. He was no longer the broken creature that had limped into the ranch. Now, Thunder stood tall and proud, his body strong and his spirit even stronger. Caleb reached out, his hand gently resting on the horse's neck. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. In many ways, Caleb felt like Thunder had healed him just as much as he had healed the horse. The bond between them was undeniable. The quiet, misunderstood rancher, and the abused stallion had become something more, something unbreakable. "You did it, Thunder," Caleb whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We did it." The horse nudged him, as if in response, and Caleb chuckled softly, running his fingers through the stallion's mane. In that moment, he realized that Thunder had given him more than just companionship. Thunder had given him purpose. And now, Caleb had something new to fight for. The sanctuary was just the beginning. He had plans, big plans, for the future. Safe Hooves Ranch would be more than just a safe haven for animals. It would become a place for healing, not just for the animals, but for the people who needed it most. As the days passed, the ranch began to take shape. With the help of the town, Caleb had started to convert part of the barn into a therapy center for children and adults alike. The horses, particularly Thunder, would play a central role in the healing process, guiding those who came to the ranch through the process of recovery. Caleb had always believed in the quiet power of animals, and now he had the chance to share that belief with others. Maya had been instrumental in organizing community outreach, ensuring that the town remained involved in the growth of the ranch. She'd brought in local schools, encouraging teachers to bring their students to the ranch for a day of learning. And she'd even helped with fundraising, securing donations to help expand the therapy programs. Slowly but surely, the once barren ranch was being transformed into something vibrant and full of life. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Caleb found himself sitting on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset as the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and pink. The sight was beautiful, but it was the sound of soft footsteps behind him that drew his attention. Maya was standing there, a warm smile on her face, a cup of coffee in her hands. "You know," she said, sitting down beside him, I never thought I'd see the day when this place became a sanctuary. I thought it would always be just a rundown ranch on the outskirts of town." Caleb smiled, taking a sip from his own cup. I think I thought the same thing, but sometimes things change when you least expect it." Maya nodded, looking out over the ranch, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You've done something incredible here, Caleb. Not just for the horses, but for the people. You've made this place a home, a place for healing, and I think it's safe to say that the town will never be the same again." Caleb looked at her, his eyes softening. "I didn't do it alone, Maya. It was the town. We all came together, and now we have something we can believe in, something worth fighting for." She smiled, her eyes sparkling. "And you're going to keep fighting, right? For the ranch, for the animals, for the town?" Caleb's expression turned serious, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "Yeah, I am. I'll keep fighting. I know there's still work to do. But with Thunder by my side and the town behind me, I know we can do anything." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "You've already done the impossible, Caleb, and now it's time for all of us to rebuild together." The next few months were a blur of activity. The ranch flourished, and Caleb's dream of creating a sanctuary became more real with each passing day. The therapy programs were a success, and Thunder was more than just a symbol. He was a leader in the healing process, his gentle nature offering comfort to those who needed it most. The townspeople who had once feared Vale now embraced the sanctuary, volunteering their time and resources to help build a brighter future for the town. One afternoon, as Caleb watched a child gently pet Thunder's muzzle, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This wasn't just about saving a horse anymore. It was about saving a piece of the town's soul, about giving people hope where there had been none. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold, Caleb stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out at the horizon. Thunder stood beside him, his dark eyes calm and wise, as if he too understood the significance of this moment, that the ranch had been saved, the town had been saved. And in many ways, Caleb had found a new beginning, one that was filled with possibility, with purpose, and with the quiet, unshakable strength of the animals and people who had become his family. He had fought for the horse, but in the end, it was the horse that had saved him.